morning, everyone. My name is Diana Fox-Carney. I'm delighted to have been the co-host of this series around Building Back Better. We are now reaching the end of the series. This is webinar number 7. I'm not sure if anyone but Toby and I have been to all of the webinars. If you have, thank you very much for your endurance. I hope you found them enlightening. If you haven't, you can find them, the reruns online, and hopefully you'll be able to look through those. In this one today, we have another fantastic group of people with us. You can see here, we are really trying to knit the ideas that we've heard about in the previous 6 weeks together and think about how we get from where we are now to where we want to be, and bring all these great suggestions and make them real, and what it's going to take both institutionally in terms of the narrative around this, and if there are any thoughts that people have as to what are the priority starting points. So there's lots to talk about today. As always, we have a lot of people, very short amount of time, but we'll do our best with that. We encourage your questions in the chat panel, in the Q&A panel at the bottom. If we don't get to them, we are recording them and we will attend to them afterwards, but we will endeavor to talk about some of them in real time today. So listen, enough of that. Let's move on. I'm very delighted that we're able to be joined today by Minister Baines, who is going to introduce our final webinar. Thank you, Minister.
Well, thank you very much, Diana, for having me on, and it really is a pleasure to be here. I love the theme of building back better. It's often cited by many of my cabinet colleagues, so this is a great theme, I think, that will resonate with the steps we take as a government and as a country moving forward as well. First of all, congratulations to you for an excellent speaker series. I know, as you indicated, this is your 7th one, and it's a privilege to be on to share some of my thoughts. I want to really highlight the importance of innovation and just underscore how critical that has been in terms of how we've dealt with the current crisis, but moving forward, how critical it will be in terms of our ability to deal with the climate change crisis as well. For me, I've talked a great deal about innovation over the past 4.5 years as the minister responsible for that file. And I fundamentally believe that innovation is critical for us to solve problems, to make society a better place. And our secret sauce in all of this has been investing in our #1 resource, in what differentiates us and what enables us to really succeed, and that is our people. It's investing in our entrepreneurs and risk takers. It's investing in our scientists and researchers, or really those highly innovative, skilled workforce that we take enormous pride in across the country. So for me, I also think what's been important above and beyond just investing in people is building on our strengths. And we have a diversified economy, and we have a strong industrial base. And to highlight that, if you take a look at the current context with regards to COVID-19, we relied very much on innovation and investing in people and their ideas, and relied on our industrial base to ramp up domestic capacity for personal protective equipment. The Made in Canada project that we launched a few months ago was a call to action to Canadians to say, look, global supply chains are unpredictable. Demand is increased for this very important personal protective equipment, and we need this for our frontline healthcare workers. We need this for our healthcare system in order to flatten the curve. And Canadians stepped up in a big way. Over 6,000 Canadians came forward with ideas and suggestions. And right now, there are 700 companies that have retooled or rescaled their initiatives, their projects, in a manner that's really helped us solve some of the problems that we're dealing with regards to personal protective equipment. Let me just give you a couple of great examples of innovation on full display and regarding that call to action. Many of you are familiar with Art McDonald, our Nobel laureate. He came forward with an idea where he used off-the-shelf parts to assemble a very easy to make ventilator at a very low cost point with working with his Italian counterparts. And we made a commitment to him to find a manufacturer and to have a purchase order of 10,000 ventilators. And that's an incredible success story of a scientist coming forward, working with our manufacturing base to really move an agenda forward on an issue that was really critical for us. And I think we will be in a fortunate position of not only meeting the needs within Canada when it comes to ventilators, but be in a position to help other countries and other jurisdictions and help our neighbors. And I think that is really a point of pride and innovation on full display. Another really cool example is medical grade gowns. This, as you can imagine, we're trying to find domestic supplies and domestic sourcing. And we realized that we've got like the Canada Gooses and the Stanfields, we've got companies that can build this material, can assemble these gowns, but they need the raw material. So we went out again to our really incredible companies and entrepreneurs and innovators and asked them, can you find some local solutions? And they came back with a construction house wrap as a raw material, as well as the nylon from the airbags in cars that can be used for medical grade gowns. And that example really just demonstrates innovation on full display. So I just wanted to highlight those two examples of what we did when it comes to personal protective equipment. And the same applies to the mindset we need to have when we're dealing with the climate change crisis. And as we move forward, I can tell you right now, we're going to continue to invest in people and their ideas and their ingenuity. That's why we made sure that there was an expansion of seed funding for Sustainable Development Technology Canada to continue to have a strong ecosystem of companies that can really scale up and succeed here in Canada and globally as well. We invested in the Strategic Innovation Fund with a very strong emphasis on projects that can help transition companies and ideas and solutions to reducing their carbon footprint. And part of that journey I want to highlight, and I know you've talked about it, is also oil and gas. And I think it's important to note that they are very much part of that journey. And we as a government fundamentally believe that. And that is why I was so delighted to announce Mark Little as part of the Industry Strategy Council. This is a group of people that are going to work with government to look at how we can continue to deal with not only the healthcare crisis and the economic crisis, but do so in a manner that enables us to hit our 2030 and exceed our 2030 targets and hit our 2050 net zero targets as well. So this is really about government working together in partnership, but it's all about innovation. And I can tell you right now, we as a government recognize that we don't have a monopoly on good ideas, that we need to continue to innovate. And in order to do that, we need industry to step up in a big way. And I've got a personal interest in this because now more than ever, I spend a lot of time at home with my two young girls. And they remind me more than ever the importance of making sure that we do not lose sight of the goals associated with our ability to meet our climate change targets. And I think, and I firmly believe what I've seen recently when it comes to the mobilization efforts around personal protective equipment, that we can have that same level of mobilization, that same Team Canada approach to tackle these very important climate change issues as well. So thank you very much for this opportunity. And I look forward to the conversation today.
Fantastic. Thank you, Minister. And I think you're absolutely right to highlight the importance of innovation, which has run through this series. I'll now pass over to Toby Heaps, who, as you all know, has really been the brains behind this series. Toby.
Thanks, Diana, and thanks, Minister. One thing that has become really clear is we have been going through this series is what a powerful engine the clean economy can be for Canada. If we move ahead, there's a slide that's going to come up, and it's going to show the synthesis of all of our analysis, which looks at if we were to mobilize $106 billion of federal government investment over the next 10 years, which would work out to about 10 billion annualized each year, about 0.4% of GDP, it could help to crowd in upwards of $700 billion of private sector and other money, and create, in terms of job years, create close to 7 million job years. So this is a serious economic engine. Hopefully it's a sustainable biofuel powered economic engine. And there's really three reasons I think that an economic economy like this is within our grasp and within our reach. And there's three reasons why we should endeavor to, as much as possible, as rationally as possible, as evidence-based as possible, make this recovery and this stimulus as green as possible. And those three reasons come down to bread, seeds, and carrots. Now the bread part is bred in people's genes, bred in people's pockets. We need to get people back to work. And what we found with this analysis is a concerted effort to invest in the green economy, the clean energy economy, could help get back over 700,000 people job years over the next 2 years. So this is a serious engine to get people back to work. It's hard to find anything else that will get that many people back to work. The seeds part is a $40 billion investment fund to help to crowd in private capital and other sources of capital to really tackle these huge opportunities in fast-growing industries of the future where we have a right to play. We have all the ingredients you need to win, whether it's about carbon fibers that are bitumen derived, or it's sustainable aviation fuels, or it's the being a North American center for batteries with the unique properties of nickel that are based in Sudbury and all the petrochemical industrial complex that we have. We have a right to play in this game, and if we play our cards right, we can have a big part of the podium of these fast-growing industries of the future. But we can't sit on our hands, or other people are going to get in a pole position. And the third reason is carrots. If we front load this $106 billion federal investment in the next 2 years, getting about $40 billion in our model, it's going to be a really effective way to both prime the pump to get industries going and bring costs down. And also it's going to be a really effective carrot for provinces to up their game and make sure they have in place complementary policies with respect to building codes and grid access for renewables and storage, which is going to be critical for unlocking these huge opportunities. In terms of just a parting thought before I close and pass it to this illustrious panel that we have here, I just wanted to thank all of you. Quite a number of you have been here for many of the sessions that we've held, and it's been a community that's built. And I think what we can see is there's a big window that is opening, and what we're proposing is not incremental. There's some big changes. And when someone proposes big changes, there will be the inevitable forces of the status quo that will resist. And I think with the community that we have here across business, investors, Indigenous communities, labor, environmental movement, I think we have what it takes to overcome that and really seize this opportunity. So look forward to working with you in the coming weeks and months to make some of these things a reality. Thank you kindly.
Thank you, Toby, for that call to arms. We'll start now by turning, hopefully putting some slides up and turning to Ralph Torrey, who's guided us through the data over the past weeks, and would like to show us some aggregate thinking from the previous weeks. Ralph, are you ready? Yes. Ralph? Are you possibly on mute?
I'm sorry. Good morning, everybody. I want to be brief. I feel a bit like the PA system before the live music started at Woodstock here, so I'll try and get out of the way quickly. But I did want to stop and just mark the wrap up of this interesting series that we've been engaged in over the last few weeks. We really feel that the pandemic pause has created a window to stop and think about where we want to go when this is over. And this series has been really about one of the opportunities that the pandemic pause presents to us, which is the chance to address the greening of the economy transition and the low carbon transition. It's been clear for a long time, for some people at least, that our economy was on a collision course with the natural ecosystems that it's dependent on. And that's why this pivot to the green economy is so critical. There's a large and accelerating body of know-how when it comes to the things that we need to do to make this transition. Anyone who has been tuning into this series has seen a glimpse into the extent of the wisdom and the knowledge that Canadians bring to this issue. And for every one of the experts that has been on our panels, there are hundreds more who are focused on this transition. What has changed, I think, is the opportunity. We have the public investor back at the table in a renewed way that opens up possibilities that have not been there in recent years. And we have an up and coming generation that is bringing enthusiasm and leadership to this issue. Whether you're talking about engineers or architects or financial professionals, they're really laser focused on this. So we, as Toby has summarized, think that we've identified a very large overlap between what's needed to restart the economy and what's needed to make the inevitable transition to a more sustainable and greener economy at the same time. And Celine is just going to summarize some of the programs that we've been analyzing over the past 6 weeks. So I'm going to turn it over to Celine for that.
Thanks very much, Ralph. So we have here basically the one-page summary of the 6 weeks that we've been presenting to you, which describes that was the right one. Great, thanks. Which describes each of the programs that we've looked at in terms of the federal investment, which is the small red bar, the leveraged private sector investment, which is the big blue bar, and then the cumulative jobs within each of the proposals, and the gray bar is the cumulative jobs with which is attached to the right-hand axis. Just to give you the sort of snapshot of that, because it's sometimes hard to look at numbers on two different axes. For the Build Back Better Homes program, we're looking at 2 million cumulative jobs, and that compares very favorably with 3 other programs. The Build Back Better Workplaces program, which is 1 million cumulative jobs. The Build Back Better EV Uptake program, which is 1.2 million jobs, and the Energy and EV Innovation Fund, which Toby described earlier, where we have the right to play to win, as he described, which would also drive about 1 million jobs. All of these programs together would reduce Canada's GHG emissions by a very substantive amount, 237 megatons per year by 2030, which would put us well on the way to reaching our goal of being able to be at a net zero level by 2050, which will require us to reduce our emissions by about 50% every decade for the next 3 decades. So this is very much in line with the scope and scale of the opportunity and the challenge that we have before us. And of course, as Minister Baines has described, it enables us to put to the service of Canadians and the environment all of the incredible innovation and innovative capacity that we have in Canada. As the Minister was speaking, I was thinking about the same sort of call to arms for building back better homes as we've done for personal protective equipment. These deep retrofits to people's homes and to our workplaces would really require us to innovate at a fundamental level how we do work in the construction industry. And I want to highlight the fact that the investments that we're proposing in these sectors are very much of the order that are currently existing or occurring today. So for example, in the case of retrofitting and decarbonizing the whole of Canada's building stock, for example, for private homes, be they apartments or houses, the current annual spend in renovations is $60 billion. What we're proposing is $20 billion. So very much in the order of what the shape of the current economy. It's the same kind of scale, comparable scale for the EV uptake program, as well as for the investments in greening the grid, which really enable everything else. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Diana and look forward to a very interesting discussion.
Thank you for that overview recap, Ralph and Celine. We're going to get into the meat of the session now. And I would like to start by thinking about the big picture here and how we frame this movement to bring people along and make sure that it is coherent and in a sense not vulnerable as this unwinds. This is not going to be something that is done by the end of 2020, just it is in the same way that the virus itself is not going to leave us, sadly, by the end of the year. So I'm going to start today with Catherine Abro from the Climate Action Network, just to give her view of what you think the big kind of goals are in this area.
Thanks, Diana. Really happy to be joining you today from unceded Algonquin and Anishinaabe territories in Ottawa. And a big congratulations to everyone involved in this huge, ambitious undertaking. It's been an incredible 7 panels, and I know we've all learned a lot from it. So really, from my perspective, this moment is really forcing us into confrontation with the vulnerabilities that are built into our economic and social systems. There are ongoing crises that lurk behind the current health and economic emergencies at hand. Inequality in income, wealth, access to essential services, racial and other forms of discrimination, colonial structures that perpetuate harmful resource and cultural extraction, and of course the externalization of environmental harm, which is ultimately what underpins the climate crisis and other forms of ecological collapse. And it's clear that these are not only vulnerabilities, but in many cases, they are also forms of tremendous violence and disruption. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge the uprising against these systems of violence and destruction that we're seeing all across North America. So from my perspective, if we are going to tackle these issues, if we're going to tackle issues like climate change, we have to come at them fundamentally as a fight for justice, as a way of bringing these intersecting vulnerabilities together, confronting them, and building resilience into those economic and social systems so that we are not faced with these overlapping, the same kind of overlapping crises in the future. We at Climate Action Network Canada, because we believe the fight for climate action is fundamentally a fight for justice, have over the last few months collaborated with hundreds of civil society organizations across the country to develop a just recovery, 6 principles for just recovery emerging out of the pandemic. You can find those principles at justrecoveryforall.ca. Right now, about 400 organizations coast to coast to coast across every sector, issue area you can imagine have signed on to those principles. And I believe that that is the framework, the overarching framework under which we must couch these really critical, detailed, granular recommendations that the work done under the Corporate Knights Project are putting forward, and the work that's happening in many other organizations. I'll finish with this thought. So in the conversation about building back better, I think a lot of us have been reflecting on the Bretton Woods moment and hoping for a Bretton Woods 2.0. At that point in history, when Bretton Woods happened in the first place, it was really led by a charismatic elected leader. This Bretton Woods, if it does happen, is going to be led by the people. And we need to be listening to those people who are in the streets risking their health and safety right now, calling for justice. If we are not able to speak to what they need, if we are not able to speak to the ways in which they're demanding safety and an improvement in their lives and their communities, then none of the recommendations that we are making are going to stick. I'm really looking forward to making some comments on some of the more specific ideas later in our conversation, but I really appreciate the opportunity to kind of set up that high level framing. Thanks, Dana.
Thank you so much. I think that's a really valuable reminder of where we are right now, but also, you know, we're fortunate to be dealing with an issue that we hope and believe can deliver on that agenda while also delivering economic prosperity and meeting climate goals. And safeguarding the future. I'm going to turn now to Michael Sabia, who is, you know, many of you will know him in different parts of his life. Obviously, he's moved from the financial system at the KES, and he's now chairs the Canada's Infrastructure Bank. He's moved to the Monk School, so he has that perspective too. So, Michael, can you just talk about how those different constituencies can perhaps be brought into this story that we're trying to tell?
Sure. Diana, thank you, and thank you for the invitation to be part of this discussion today. I'd like to focus on, I mean, we all reflect, I think, a lot on just how unsettling all of these, the times are that we're living. I want to focus on the other side of that coin, which I think has been implicit in some of the comments already made. And that is, you know, the positive side of all of the disruption that we're living is, I think, both the demand, that these times demand both creativity and they encourage creativity. And I think creativity is what we're going to need going forward. The demand for it, obviously, given the severity of the issues being faced, but also they encourage them for, I think an important reason, which is really, I think for the first time in living memory, so many of the standard operating procedures that are so often a straitjacket and a constraint on creativity are essentially gone. The fact that we're having this conversation in this manner today is evidence of that. The fact that most offices are empty, but work continues. I mean, I could go on. There are lots of things that indicate how our world, our constrained world of standard operating procedures is basically out the window. And that's a rare moment. And it's a moment not to be missed. And in my view, collectively, I think this is true actually on a multilateral basis across the world, but it's certainly true as Canadians, that we need to seize this moment. We can't waste this moment. And we need to seize this moment to be creative about how we reposition the national economy for a world that's going to be different. And yes, a very important part of that is repositioning our economy to be a lower carbon economy, a significantly lower one, but to put the country on a different path going forward. And that's important because I think a fundamental issue facing all of us now is rebuilding confidence on the part of businesses, consumers, citizens across the board. And I think that issue about the need for creativity, this is true across a whole range of issues, and Minister Baines touched on some of these, but it's true in terms of what we're doing in trade, what we're doing in innovation policy, our thinking about cities, the future of income security, and yes, obviously, given my role at the Infrastructure Bank, it's very true about infrastructure. And at the bank, which, and I'll be quite open with people about this, it's an institution, I think, with lots of potential, but has it underperformed to date? Yes, I think it has. So that turnaround that we're trying to do at the bank is guided by or based on two pretty simple ideas. First, yes, the bank can and should play a role in reigniting the Canadian economy, but that has to be done in a constructive way. It has to be constructive stimulus. So what does that mean? Well, it means contributing to the repositioning of the national economy. A critical dimension of that is taking actions to accelerate the transition that Canada and the world has to go through to get to lower carbon industries and a lower carbon economy. That's point number one, and it's fundamental. Second point, to come back to what I said earlier, we need to be creative. We need to be creative about broadening what we mean by infrastructure. It's not just about roads and ports. It's not about the past. It's about the future. Critically important, and that, of course, is this transition to a lower carbon economy. But second, we also need to be more creative about how we invest, about how we work with private capital, how we bring private capital and harness it into this very important transition that the world and that Canada certainly has to go through. I won't take more time, Diana, right now. I'll just say that, in terms of our high-level priorities, and I'd be happy to elaborate on these, but, we're very interested in different power systems and improving the east-west functioning of the electricity grid in Canada, renewables and storage. We're very interested in getting to a lower carbon intensity form of transportation, both in cities and between cities. Very important, very heavy focus now, I think, on cities. They're critical as drivers of economic growth, but they have to work. They have to work from an environmental point of view. So again, we're very interested in thinking about cities as a platform for lower carbon growth. And then finally, digitization, having to do with both connectivity, and if this crisis has shown us anything, it's that connectivity to high broadband capability is essential for households and for small and medium businesses. But more than that, and in the future, it's about digital platforms, digital health platforms, 5G, privacy platforms. All of these things fit into what I think needs to be the broader and more creative mandate of the bank as it plays a broader role in repositioning our economy and encouraging this transition to a lower and therefore more sustainable carbon intensity.
Thank you so much, Michael, and thank you for your obvious energy and drive. We've got lots for you to be doing at the Infrastructure Bank, so don't worry about that. You set us up well, I think, to pass now to Gregor Robertson on the urban agenda. Obviously, former mayor, Vancouver, but now global ambassador for the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy. And I'd love to know how that group is thinking about the future.
Thanks, Diana, and to Toby and the Corporate Knights team. It's been a fantastic series, and I think very timely given our circumstances. Cities and communities around the world are certainly struggling significantly in light of the combination of the COVID-19 pandemic and climate impacts. Generally, there's been a massive shortage in funding available and jurisdiction decision-making available at the local government level. Those reforms are long overdue, particularly in places like Canada. We're not seeing significant leadership globally from national governments other than the big package that's on the table right now in Europe. The Green Deal in Europe is a very dramatic continental scale strategy that we hope is going to roll out, that drives right down to city level, that empowers cities across Europe to go carbon neutral by 2030. A lot of those pieces have been in place for years, but they're capitalizing on the opportunity. The European Commission's leadership right now is fantastic, and that's a great solution for Europe. We're all going to be chasing Europe unless we see comparable scale investment in a green and healthy and just recovery. That's the framing that they're using in Europe, and I think we've got to be on the same path. If we look back at the recession a decade ago, several countries capitalized, South Korea being one, where they targeted clean tech, they targeted innovation, and over the past decade, they've risen to being one of the leading countries almost every year in terms of innovation, job creation, and the successful economy. They were a developing country a generation ago. So we've seen success down this path, but it has to run through the cities. And I would really reemphasize what Michael said. Cities are a fantastic platform. That's where innovation is driving. They connect obviously to rural Canada. The need for resources, the need for innovation in rural Canada is critical, but we have to leverage the power that's in cities. And I think if you look at what cities are asking for right now, decarbonizing, regulating, improving building codes, making sure that buildings are contributing, which they're not helping us at all right now, not significantly. We've shut down most of the economy and transportation, but we need buildings to really contribute if we're going to hit the 1.5 commitment. But I think there's a very willing partner in Canada's cities and communities. The Green Municipal Fund has been great. It needs to be cranked up significantly. It's a solid model that other countries are emulating. So we've got some pieces in place. I'm just really hopeful that the frame of going from the COVID-19 crisis to back onto the climate crisis and the economic impacts that we face from here forward, the government needs to filter all of these investments with decarbonization and follow that up with regulations at the federal level that support cities to follow that through. I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think we need a constant reminder that we need to seize this crisis, work with it, and use the space to really ensure that this agenda doesn't get accidentally or deliberately pushed down again, and we'll come to that. One of the issues in this space, obviously, is around where the money comes from. Lots of demands on money at the moment. I'm just going to turn now to Tom Rand, but before I do that, I'm going to call our first poll. Those of you who were with us last week will know that I forgot the poll, so I didn't get any audience input. And Melanie, if you could just put up our first poll, which is where, oh, no. I thought the poll was going to be, okay. Sorry, my apologies. I thought the poll was going to be about the source of the money, but that must be poll number 2. Anyway, this one is just suggesting, can we afford it? So apologies for my error there, but I'm very delighted that many of you are agreeing that we can, and then we're going to come to where the money comes from. But in the meantime, I'm going to turn over to Tom Rand now, who is managing partner of Arcturn Ventures. And he has both a perspective on the clean tech economy, a deep one, but also on the financing of it. Perhaps, Tom, you could explain to us how you see this from a private finance perspective and what you see the ability of this public money really to unleash private capital will be.
Sure, and I think the starting point is to understand the advantages and activity we already have that we're building on, right? So really we're talking about the long-term self-interested economic advantage of building industries in Canada, innovative industries that Minister Baines was talking about, at a kind of scale that Michael talks about, which affects infrastructure all over the world. So cities in Canada, but cities all around the world. So we're talking about not deploying existing EV chargers for new electric vehicles, for example, but building the next generation of EV chargers and selling those EV chargers to the rest of the world, and the long-term economic advantage to Canada of getting into those industries and leveraging capital in those industries. I mean, it's a bit like getting into digital telecom back in the 80s or internet infrastructure in the 90s, right? This is an enormous market. And it's kind of where Canada's environmental aspirations and our economic self-interest kind of dovetail. If we can export solutions to the rest of the planet, we not only make money, but we're lowering emissions at a global scale because we're lowering the cost of compliance of other countries. So that's kind of what Arcturn does, is build those technologies. And I think it's important to realize how much we already have in Canada. The seeds that have been planted, particularly by our partners in Ottawa at Sustainable Development Technology Canada, strongly supported, bipartisan support across all parties for 15 years. There's a really big, very strong Canadian farm team in clean tech that are punching above their weight globally. These are obviously technologies that export: energy storage, next generation biofuels, power electronics, all that kind of stuff. What we're also seeing are the institutions in Canada beginning to dabble in this space. So Arcturn, we have as LPs, we have CPP, Canada Pension Plan, we have OMERS, we have Suncor, who are looking to us to figure out how they become a low carbon energy company. And they're pretty serious about that. So the institutions are dabbling in venture capital. We also have a big pension fund from Norway. Nisno has invested in Arcturn, as has Equinor. They're a big oil and gas company. And they did that because they saw Canada as a leader, not just in terms of the seeds we've planted in public-private partnerships and building technologies out, but in the long-term policy support for clean tech and climate and so on. And they see Canada as the place to be in North America today. And we can build on that advantage, certainly with what's happening south of the border. And so the question is how we build on that. What do we do next to further accelerate this capital? Because it's not venture capital. It's not the hundreds of millions of dollars. It's the many billions of dollars that we need to deploy, and figuring out ways to link next generation technology to infrastructure without bringing inordinate risk. So project finance, infrastructure banks, pension funds can play because it's a blended finance model and a smart view of what kinds of technologies scale up. There's a lot of detail there, but linking the venture world, the technology world, the innovation world of Minister Baines to the infrastructure bank of Michael Sabia is precisely what I think needs to be done and where all the real action and economic gain is. So there's some detail there, and I can return to that issue, but that's really where I think a very strong policy can play in Canada to leverage private capital in building those bridges from technology to infrastructure all over our cities, but cities all over the planet. I think that's the real long-term economic activity above and beyond shovels in the ground that we have here.
Thank you, Tom. That's really interesting. I mean, Gregor mentioned that the European community is ahead on some of the policy in this space. I think that is, there's unequivocal agreement on that. But in terms of the companies and there's a sort of nuts and bolts of the clean tech, the bleeding edge of clean tech, time and again, Canada is on that list. Canada's companies are at the forefront of that list. And some of you will know that I'm currently sitting in London, and that we talk about that here. We talk about, you know, both the Canadian pension funds at the big end of kind of Canada's influence, and also the small companies that are scrappily going after this market. And I think if there are things we can do, someone said in the chat panel, can we persuade Tesla to come here? Well, you know, my argument would be, yes, if we get the Made in Canada brand to be the kind of this is the stamp you need to be forging ahead in the green economy, because we have 100% clean energy, etc. We've got a much higher chance. So lots of opportunities. With that, lots of optimism. With that, I'm going to pass over to Bruce Lowry now, who many of you will also know from the Ivy Foundation. And he wanted to pick up on the points around innovation.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Diana. I share the optimism around the opportunities that we have and the skills that we have in this country. But I want to pick up a little bit on what Michael was saying, that we really need creativity, and we really need to think very differently about what makes economies succeed, what accelerates the innovation outside of money, and that's policy. And we need in this country a stronger sense of the role that governments, that cities, businesses can play in procurement, in standards, in creating the policy environment that accelerates the adoption of technology. So this just isn't a money matter. And we're still seeing economists telling us that governments can't pick winners. And I just think that is a tired and misguided refrain for us to be using, because in fact, Germany picks winners, South Korea picks winners, the United States picks winners. And we need our country to be a little more creative and a little more, I think, forward-looking around the role that we can play as, as cities, as the federal government, provinces, in understanding what is our comparative advantage. So whether it's getting the building technologies at scale and breaking down some of the bureaucratic barriers that are preventing the adoption of this kind of technology, looking at the obvious advantage we have in hydrogen right now in this country, which I don't know it's been discussed here, but a huge technological comparative advantage that we have that's going to help Alberta possibly become, the hydrogen hub for North America. And yet, if we don't have the kind of supportive policies that will build out, we've got fuel cell manufacturers, we've got trucking manufacturers, busing manufacturers, we can be a global leader. So I think, I'm not sure Tesla's going to move to Canada, but we could be creating a domestic hydrogen-based long-haul freight industry in this country. And that's the kind of stuff I think we need to be looking at. And governments can't just throw money, they have to put policy heft behind that.
Thank you, Bruce. We have a note in the panel here that's saying Tesla is here already. They're partnering with Dalhousie on advanced batteries. So maybe we have to persuade them to bring a bit more here. But I agree with you that there's a lot of made in Canada opportunities too. I'm now going to bring in Diane Sachs, who was previously, until 2019, the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario. How does this look to you, Diane? You've been at that kind of interface of government and the development of an economy and public opinion around these issues. How do you think, A, we best create the narrative, B, sell it to people, and C, kind of get the governments alongside to facilitate the progress we're going to make?
Well, thank you, Diana. That's a lot to do in a couple of minutes. My last climate report to the Ontario legislature, we did look at what is the economically best way of getting to a low carbon economy. In other words, what will do the most good and cost the least? And it was pretty clear. First, you maximize efficiency, don't waste energy anywhere. Biggest opportunity quickly is in buildings, because we waste a huge amount of energy heating buildings that goes through the outside air and cooling them as well. The second step is to drive fossil out of electricity generation, which is increasingly saves money in any event, because solar, wind, and storage have become so much cheaper. And then electrify everything practicable, starting with transportation, because most of our transportation uses petroleum products, highly polluting from a climate point of view, highly polluting from an air quality and public health point of view, and also draining an enormous amount of money out of the province every year, $16 to $25 billion. And the fourth thing was to restore and expand natural infrastructure. That's not so much a question of reducing carbon emissions, but of increasing resilience and our ability to survive what's coming. All of these objectives require stable policies that don't change when governments do. And as you all know, I think we had very good climate policies in Ontario until the Ford government was elected. We had a good climate law. I mean, there were lots of things to complain about, and I did complain at great length. But in a nutshell, we were on the right track. We had a lot to be proud of, and we were doing an enormous amount of good. And it was all torn up as soon as the Ford government was elected, even though almost every one of the Conservatives elected had signed a pledge to support having a price on carbon. So the biggest challenge is how to have stable policies that survive changes in government. And that is really difficult. As a lawyer, I think of legal options. There are some legal options that help. There's a suggestion to put it in the Constitution. That's the Blue Dot campaign, because constitutions have some greater protection when governments change. Lawsuits are really long shots, but can make a difference. The Urgenda lawsuit in the Netherlands has in fact forced the Dutch government to shut down their coal-fired power plant. The LaRose case in Canada, you know, it's got legs. It might do something in terms of moving the goalposts for the federal government, whether through admissions or access to documents or opportunities to negotiate or other sorts of things. There's statutes like the UK Climate Act, which has really been designed to try to drain out some of the political poison by putting a big time gap between when decisions are made and when they have to be complied with, which reduces some of the political short-term gamesmanship. There's personal responsibility for lawmakers, which the Nordic Council does. So those are some of the legal options, which can help a little. Fundamentally, though, to get durable public policy, we need strong, loud, consistent public and business and art demands for it. Politicians care enormously what their constituents say, right, Gregor? Politicians really, really, really are influenced by what they hear from the people who talk to them. And they hear very, very frequently from the paid lobbyists from the fossil fuel industries who have an enormous amount of money to get that kind of message across, and do so over and over and over and over again. And Canadian Environmental Defense showed that the oil and gas lobby lobbied the federal government about 4 times a day for the last many years, and greatly more frequently now. So they hear from these folks all the time. So what's the other voice? Well, we need to hear responsible business loudly and frequently. They need to hear it in public, they need to hear it in private. Every one of you can join a group of some kind, whether it's a business group, a gardening group, a municipal group, and get climate on those agendas, because they don't get dismissed as easily as someone who's just the usual suspects. The federal carbon tax is designed to try to buy some public support as compared to cap and trade, which is a better economic model. I was satisfied, but people didn't understand it and doesn't put money back in their pockets. It's unfortunate most people don't know they're getting the federal carbon refund, so that's another messaging issue, but at least it was designed to try to buy some ongoing public support. But the bottom line is that people at every level need to speak up and have to never get tired of speaking up. And I ask everyone, every audience, to memorize 11 magic words. Simple, clear messages. Say it back to me. Simple, clear messages. Repeated often by a variety of trusted voices. Simple, clear messages repeated often by a variety of trusted voices. Everybody needs to speak up on this all the time. And one opportunity right now, which may not have crossed your radar, is the Senate National Finance Committee. I mean, nobody pays any attention to the Senate, I know, but they really do have influence. And they are going to be writing a report really shortly about how the federal government spends its billions of dollars on COVID response. So between now and June 9th, each of you could write to the Senate National Finance Committee and talk about how the federal government should be responding to this crisis and the importance of building back better. Pay attention to these kinds of windows and write in.
Thank you so much, Diane. We've all got our marching orders. We need to be mobilized. I want to turn to Terry Lynn Morrison now and talk about, can we mobilize the Indigenous community? I know you've talked a lot over these past weeks and been a very enthusiastic supporter of both the agenda, but about the contribution of the Indigenous community in this space. So perhaps you could just refresh us on that.
Thank you, Diana. Just listening to the panelists this morning and reflecting on the title of the series, Building Back Better, as an Indigenous person in Canada, it feels that that's sort of what we've been trying to do all of these years. So I see that there's a huge opportunity here for the government and for industry and for Indigenous communities to come together on this, shared vision that we have for what the recovery should look like. It's very obvious that the next stage of the Canadian and global energy revolution will emphasize further renewable energy development, enhanced energy efficiency of homes, community facilities and industry, also advanced energy systems and green energy infrastructure. And these developments offer major economic development and climate action opportunities for Indigenous communities in this country. Some major forces that are shaping the future. Firstly, Indigenous communities and enterprises are already beginning to seize opportunities that reflect a transition process characterized by the decarbonization and digitalization of energy. Secondly, there is a growing group of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit champions, including the 2020 catalysts that come from Indigenous Clean Energy, the organization that I work for, along with community leadership with the skills and experience to take projects and partnerships forward. Thirdly, Indigenous communities have a broad-based interest in realizing economic benefits from clean energy, particularly through Indigenous companies. And also, we have First Nation, Métis, and Inuit communities and leaders that are incredibly motivated to take action on climate change through clean energy. So I've been lucky enough to have the opportunity to work with Indigenous communities across the country. They're ready to seize the opportunity, and having conversations like this and bringing everybody along is going to be important. I'll leave you with that, and thank you for having me as part of this series.
It's been a great pleasure, and you've been a very important and consistent voice in this space, so thank you so much for that. And I think this very much speaks to Catherine's point at the beginning about the type of opportunity we have here, but also the need for change, because there's many people for whom life isn't working as well as it should at the moment. On which note, I'm going to, before I get back to the finance, I know you're still avidly waiting for the results of the poll, but I'm going to turn to Kareem Bardizi from the Ryerson Leadership Lab, the Executive Director. Leadership, tell us some of your thoughts, but also tell us your thinking on how we can lead this type of initiative going forward.
Thanks, Diana. I think in this context, leadership comes from summoning some of those values and traits that were identified earlier on, and in particular, the ones that are coming to mind are the one Michael Sabia quoted around creativity, and Catherine Abreu's reference to justice as values and motivators that are going to guide this work. I believe there is a great opportunity by channeling those values and those traits to reach the full set of tools that have been talked about in the series that Ralph and Celine have laid out, and a bunch of tools that have not gotten as much airing in this conversation, but as we've seen in the chat box and in the question and answer box, there's a really rich set of tools that need to come together for this. And all evidence is that there's a majority consensus, not just for individual tools, but for the full set of tools. And leadership comes from recognizing that people within their institutions, within their place, access their understanding of this issue differently. And so there's an opportunity for leaders and institutions to look to their constituents and say, you know what, I might not be able to connect that person to an understanding of carbon pricing, but I might be able to connect that person, that member of my institution, this member of my group, into some aspect of this work. They're not going to necessarily understand the policy talk right away. They're not necessarily going to understand the activist language that many of us would be speaking right away. But they have opportunities through those values around justice, through an understanding that there is a majority consensus towards this to be reached. And I believe that by leaders reaching beyond the policy players and the experts, but inviting them into the conversation around public policy and around the language of activism, using those tools of creativity and that desire for justice and that desire for systemic change that we know from public opinion data is widespread, that is how we can achieve this moment. And it is a fundamentally political act to do this, and it's not just through political parties, but it's through institutions, it's through member-driven organizations channeling those values towards these goals.
Fantastic. I think, yeah, that sort of empowering of politicians to move forward and giving them the confidence. I'd love to talk more about that, but we don't have any time really. I'm going to tell you that in our poll, we had we had a total of 80% of people did agree, either strongly or otherwise, that we could afford these measures, 0.4% of GDP. We did also have 13% who didn't agree, said that we couldn't afford them. And obviously public finances are tight. And I want to turn now to Celine again and to Dave Sawyer. I'm going to bring in Dave first and just talk about, how feasible really do you feel this is economically? Is this money, is this money there? Will it leverage other money? What hurdles are we going to, economic hurdles will we encounter on the way? Because it's not going to be easy for sure.
Yeah, sure. Leveraging private finance in a time of COVID with liquidity crunches is a major issue. I think also we need to think about co-benefits and climate resilience, which haven't been mentioned here. So when we think about selecting mitigation options, I think we have to take a broader view rolling forward to deal with systemic vulnerabilities like air pollution and health, and like climate impacts associated, with a changing climate. So I think those are, we need to be a little more thoughtful about sort of our focus on dollars per ton and opportunities and economic multipliers to branch out our thinking to include co-benefits, maximizing health benefits and reducing future vulnerabilities around climate change, basically, which is a really systemic risk that is a big long-term risk. So I'll stop there. Thank you, Diana.
Celine, your thoughts?
Yeah, so I two different things. One is that there has been some very good work on parts of the Canadian tax system that frankly need attention and reform. Loopholes and other sort of mechanisms within the Canadian tax system which could be closed and which would very, very quickly provide us with the $10 billion that we're talking about in terms of the annual investments for the programs we've described. I'd also would suggest that the green bond market is still very small, less than 0.25% of the global bond market, sovereign and other and corporate, but it does send a signal, and it would, I think, be very interesting for Canada to consider issuing a green bond where the proceeds would be ring-fenced for the purposes that we've described today. And where reporting on use of those proceeds would occur. Other countries have done this, France has done it, and it leads to a great deal of discipline around the structure of the programs, around the institutions that participate, et cetera. I guess I'll add that we have the institutions to do this. We've obviously heard from Michael Sabia. I want to make sure that we mention the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation. One of the reasons why we put the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation really at the core of our proposal about deep retrofits to homes is because it creates information which is fundamental to making efficient markets. And so those markets build up and become completely economic and independent of any policy support because there's confidence in the value that's being done. And the CMHC is an example of an institution that could bring confidence to a very, very large market opportunity.
Thank you, Celine. I think always working with what you have is very important, but we must be careful not to be incremental in that approach. It's that sort of tension between starting from where we are, but also being truly ambitious and where we want to get to. Listen, we've come to the end of our time and the end of our series. There's so many points that have come up today that I would love to have picked up on, and people have tempted us by saying I could come back and talk about that. I want to bring in at the very end, I just want to ask Ralph, who's been the kind of stalwart behind all this, whether he has, having looked through in great detail all the sectors, all the ideas that have come up, maybe he doesn't, maybe he's just tired and wants to go to bed, but do you have any reflections on where we are, where we need to be, and what's the kind of first step we should be taking, Ralph?
Well, thank you, Diana. I know we're at the end of this hour, so I'll be very brief. On a personal note, and there may be people who are listening who have lost a loved one to COVID, I think it should be appreciated that what we're trying to do here is, and what we've been doing in this series, it's really to honor the memory. I mean, there are really people who are dying to pay the price, if you want to put it that way, of opening this door for us. We can see through the threshold that there are wonderful possible practical futures waiting for us if we can have the resolve and the creativity, which has been a recurring theme I was pleased to see today, to realize the solutions that are waiting to be built. So we're going to hear a lot of talk about how we need to stick to the economic fundamentals. We've seen that in some of the editorial pages in the last few days. But let's, in all of this, remember the most fundamental of the economic fundamentals, which is the economy is embedded in and completely dependent on the natural ecosystems in which it takes place. And as go those ecosystems, so goes the economy. So where are we going to go?
Thank you. That is a sobering reminder of the challenges we face and the need to preserve. We're 1 minute over, 2 minutes over already, but the very last word goes to Toby, who's brought us all together. Thank you for that, Toby. I'm going to let Toby talk out, so I'm going to say goodbye and thank you for being here over the weeks. Let's continue the conversation and let's get the absolute best out of this crisis. So, Toby, I'll pass to you. Thank you.
Just briefly, thanks, Diana, for doing such a wonderful job corralling all of these panels. And thanks for all the panelists and all the people that participated. The next few weeks in particular, and the next couple of months in particular, are going to be a critical time to be creative and to be bold, to take these ideas forward. And we're going to be coming up with an action plan for that. I invite anybody with ideas that wants to be part of it to get in touch. We would definitely appraise everybody and invite you to join the movement to get this done. This will be very much, as Kat said, a people-led movement to make this happen. And so from the bottom of my heart, thanks everybody for participating, and we're just getting started.